October 23, 1942. El Alamein, Egypt, the desert had no mercy. Obergefreiter Klaus Brenner pressed his face against the scorching metal of the Panzer III, feeling the heat sear through his dust-caked uniform. Around him, the Afrika Korps positions stretched across the godforsaken wasteland like a string of broken teeth. Minefields, artillery emplacements, and foxholes carved into rock-hard sand. For months, they had been told victory was inevitable. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox himself, would lead them to the Suez Canal. To glory. That was before the British learned how to fight. "Brenner!" Feldwebel Otto Hartmann's voice cut through the mechanical roar of distant engines. "Get your head down. Their artillery's ranging in." Klaus dropped into the trench just as the first shells screamed overhead. The sound was familiar now. A whistling death song that had accompanied them from Tobruk to Gazala, from triumph to this grinding stalemate. The explosion shook the earth, throwing up geysers of sand and shrapnel. Someone screamed. Someone always screamed. In the relative silence that followed, Klaus pulled out the crumpled letter from his tunic pocket. His sister Greta's handwriting was barely legible after months of handling. "Dear Klaus, Munich is changing. Mother says we must be careful what we say, even to neighbors. Father asks about you constantly. He keeps your iron cross on the mantle. Come home safe. Your loving sister, Greta." April 1942. April. A lifetime ago. "You still reading that thing?" Otto slid into the trench beside him, his weathered face caked with layers of dirt and sweat. At 38, he was ancient by infantry standards, a veteran of the Great War who should have been teaching school in Hamburg instead of dying in North Africa. "Helps me remember why we're here," Klaus said, though he was no longer certain of the answer. Otto spat into the sand. "We're here because Rommel's waiting for fuel that will never come, and Montgomery's sitting across that minefield with more tanks than we've seen in our entire lives." He lit a cigarette with shaking hands. "You want to know why we're really here, camarade? Because someone in Berlin decided Egypt was worth dying for." Before Klaus could respond, the horizon exploded. October 23, 1942, 2140 hours. The barrage began with mathematical precision. General Bernard Montgomery's plan, Operation Lightfoot, called for 1,000 guns to fire simultaneously along a 6-mile front. The effect was apocalyptic. Klaus would later struggle to describe it, how the world became fire and thunder, how the very air seemed to ignite, how men disappeared into red mist before they could scream. The British 25-pounders spoke in a continuous roar, each shell adding its voice to an orchestra of annihilation. The famous German artillery, which had crushed opponents from Poland to France, was overwhelmed, outnumbered, outranged. "Gas masks!" someone shouted, and Klaus scrambled to comply before realizing it was smoke, not gas. The British were laying down a smoke screen, preparing for the infantry assault. Through the chaos, Klaus saw Hauptmann Friedrich Weber running between positions, his face illuminated by shell bursts. Weber was everything the propaganda posters promised. Square-jawed, fearless, the perfect Aryan officer. He had personally destroyed 3 British tanks at Tobruk with magnetic mines. Now he looked like a man watching his world end. "Hold positions," Weber commanded, his voice barely audible. "The Führer expects—" A shell landed 10 meters away. Klaus felt himself lifted and thrown, the world tumbling in slow motion. He hit the ground hard, ears ringing, tasting blood and cordite. When his vision cleared, Weber was gone, simply gone, as if he had never existed. "Brenner! Klaus!" Otto was shaking him. "We're falling back. The Tommies are through the minefield." But there was nowhere to fall back to. The barrage had destroyed communications, obliterated supply lines, turned their defensive positions into a killing ground. Klaus stumbled forward, rifle in hand, joining the stream of retreating soldiers. Around them, the desert burned. November 4th, 1942, near Fuka, Egypt, the retreat had become a rout. Field Marshal Rommel, legendary and brilliant, had finally been forced to acknowledge reality. Without fuel, without ammunition, without hope of reinforcement, the Afrika Korps was finished. Hitler's order to stand or die had been quietly ignored. They ran. Klaus's unit, what remained of it, had been separated during the withdrawal. 50 men had become 30, then 20, then 12. They moved at night, hiding during the day among rocky outcroppings, watching British Spitfires strafe the roads. The lucky ones died quickly. "Water's gone," announced Gefreiter Hans Meyer, the youngest among them at just 19. His face was sunburned beyond recognition, lips cracked and bleeding. Otto checked his canteen, shook it, heard nothing. "We need to surrender." Surrender? Klaus couldn't believe what he was hearing. "We're soldiers of the Reich. We're dead men if we don't." Otto interrupted, his voice flat with exhaustion. "Look at us, Klaus. Look at young Hans there. He'll be corpse in 12 hours without water. Is that the heroic death you want? Dying of thirst in the sand so Hitler can add another statistic to his casualty reports?" Klaus looked at the faces around him. Boys and old men, hollow-eyed and broken. The propaganda films had never shown this part. The songs of glory had never mentioned the taste of defeat. "There." Otto pointed toward a dust cloud in the distance. "British patrol. We wave white, we get water, we get to live. Maybe we see our families again." "Maybe we never see them again," Klaus whispered, but he was already tearing a strip from his shirt. November 4th, 1942, 14:30 hours. The British soldiers who accepted their surrender were professional, almost bored. Lance Corporal James Whitmore of the 7th Armored Division had processed hundreds of German prisoners in the past week alone. "Weapons there, personal items there, form a line," he droned in heavily accented German. "You'll be searched, documented, and transported to a holding facility. Try anything stupid, and you'll be shot. Clear?" Klaus stood in line, watching his rifle. His grandfather's rifle, carried through Flanders in 1917, being tossed onto a growing pile. His Iron Cross went into a bag with other contraband. His letters from Greta, miraculously, were allowed to remain. "Name and rank," a British sergeant demanded. "Obergefreiter Klaus Brenner, 15th Panzer Division." The sergeant made a note, attached a tag to Klaus's uniform. "You're lucky, Jerry. Proper food, proper water, and you'll probably survive this war. Better than what your lot did to our boys at Dunkirk." Klaus said nothing. What was there to say? He had lost everything except his life. As they were marched toward the trucks, Otto moved close beside him. "Remember what I said, Klaus. We get to live. That's victory enough." But as Klaus climbed into the truck bed, watching the desert recede behind them, he wondered if survival was the same as living. The war had taken his freedom, his pride, his certainty. What would captivity take? The truck rumbled eastward, toward Cairo, toward an uncertain future. In his pocket, Greta's letter crinkled softly, a reminder of a world that seemed impossibly distant, impossibly lost. "Come home safe," she had written. Klaus closed his eyes and tried to believe he still could. December 8th, 1942. British Transit Camp, Cairo, Egypt. The camp was a limbo between worlds. Klaus had spent 5 weeks behind British barbed wire, learning the rhythms of captivity. Morning roll call, watery tea, and hard biscuits. Hours of nothing punctuated by more nothing. The days bled together in a haze of desert heat and monotony, each man nursing his private wounds, some visible, most not. Americans, Otto said one evening, squatting in the dust beside Klaus. "The guards are saying they're shipping us to America." Klaus looked up from the letter he was trying to write to Greta. The censors would read it, perhaps laugh at his carefully chosen words, perhaps never send it at all. That's impossible. America is across an ocean crawling with U-boats. They'd never risk it. They're doing it anyway. Otto pulled out a cigarette, traded from a British guard for his wedding ring. Think about it. The Tommies don't want to feed us, don't want to house us. And the Americans. He paused, exhaling smoke. The Americans have everything. Space, food, safety. For them, we're not a burden. We're just another problem money can solve. Hans Meyer, still looking like a scarecrow despite weeks of regular meals, joined them. His sunburn had healed into an uneven tan that made him look older than his 19 years. My father always said Americans were soft, spoiled by luxury. Is it true? Your father, Otto said carefully, believed what Goebbels told him to believe, as did we all. Klaus folded his unfinished letter. When do we leave? Tomorrow. They're loading us on trucks to Alexandria, then ships. Otto's expression was unreadable. At least we'll die together, Kameraden. The Atlantic in winter. Those U-boats won't distinguish between British freighters and prison ships. But Klaus found he didn't care. Death by torpedo seemed no worse than slow rot in an Egyptian prison camp. At least drowning would be quick. December 15th, 1942, HMT Duchess of Richmond, Mediterranean Sea. The ship was overcrowded, understaffed, and utterly vulnerable. Klaus stood on the deck, a privilege granted only because the holds below were packed beyond capacity, watching the Mediterranean slip past. The Duchess of Richmond, a converted passenger liner, carried 1,800 German and Italian prisoners of war, guarded by barely 200 British soldiers. If the prisoners decided to mutiny, the guards would be overwhelmed in minutes. But no one mutinied. Where would they go? Into the sea. Gott im Himmel, breathed a voice beside him. Lieutenant Peter Vogel, a Luftwaffe pilot shot down over Malta, pointed toward the horizon. Convoy. Klaus followed his gaze. 8 merchant ships, protected by 2 corvettes and a destroyer, stretched across the water in formation. The convoy system. Britain's lifeline, bringing supplies from America while running the gauntlet of German submarines. We're part of it, Peter realized. We're being shipped across the Atlantic with their supply convoy. The irony was bitter. These same ships might be carrying ammunition that would kill their comrades on the Eastern Front, food that would feed British troops in Burma, fuel for bombers that would devastate German cities. And Klaus, who had fought for the Reich, was now cargo alongside it all. December 20th, 1942, Mid-Atlantic. The U-boat attack came on the 6th day. Klaus was below deck, crammed into a hold with 300 other men, when the first explosion shook the ship. The lights went out. Men screamed in the darkness, clawing toward the hatches, crushing each other in blind panic. "Rue!" Otto's parade ground voice cut through the chaos. "Silence! Panicking will kill you faster than any torpedo." Someone found a lantern. In its flickering light, Klaus saw faces stretched in terror. These were soldiers who had faced British tanks, who had endured artillery barrages, who had charged through minefields. But this was different. This was helpless waiting, trapped in a metal coffin while death hunted from below. Another explosion, closer. The ship groaned, metal shrieking against metal. "We're hit," someone whispered. But the ship kept moving. Above them, depth charges thundered as the escort vessels counterattacked. Klaus could picture it. The U-boat commander, maybe someone he'd known in training, maybe a boy from his own village, squinting through a periscope, calculating angles, trying to sink them all. Gross Admiral Karl Donitz had famously declared unrestricted submarine warfare against Allied shipping. His U-boat wolf packs terrorized the Atlantic, sending thousands to watery graves. Did Donitz know some of those ships carried German prisoners? Did he care? The attack lasted 3 hours. When it finally ended, the U-boat either destroyed or driven off, Klaus emerged on deck to see one of the merchant ships listing badly, its crew abandoning ship. The destroyer circled like a protective wolf, scanning for the enemy below. 17 men lost from the SS Manchester, a British guard told them, his voice hollow. Just boys, most of them, younger than you lot. Klaus thought of the U-boat crew, also boys, also following orders. War had become a machine that consumed the young and called it necessary. December 28, 1942, approaching New York Harbor. Is that? Klaus pressed against the rail, hardly believing what he saw. Through the morning mist, a massive figure emerged, a woman in robes, holding a torch aloft, green against the pale sky. The Statue of Liberty, breathed Hans Meyer, his eyes wide. I've seen photographs, but even Otto, cynical Otto who trusted nothing, seemed moved. My father came through here in 1911, he said quietly. Wrote home about it. Said he'd never seen anything so magnificent. The ship glided past the statue into New York Harbor, and Klaus felt his carefully maintained hatred begin to crack. He had been taught that America was decadent, weak, corrupted by Jews and capitalists and mongrel races. The propaganda had shown him race riots and breadlines, a nation on the verge of collapse. But this was something else entirely. The city rose before them like a vision from another world. Buildings taller than anything in Munich or Berlin, so many that they seemed to crowd each other for space. Cars streamed along visible highways. Ships of every description filled the harbor. Freighters, tankers, naval vessels, ferries. And everywhere, impossible, incomprehensible abundance. They don't look like they're losing a war, Peter Vogel observed, his pilot's eyes taking in every detail. They look like they're just beginning to fight. A young SS officer, Klaus avoided him when possible, spat over the rail. American propaganda. They build tall buildings while their people starve. They have no culture, no discipline. We'll crush them eventually. But his voice lacked conviction. They all saw it now, the terrible truth that propaganda had hidden. America was vast, wealthy, untouched by war. Its factories hummed at full capacity. Its cities stood intact, free of bomb craters. While Germany scraped together resources for a war on 3 fronts, America had barely begun to mobilize its enormous potential. How do you defeat this? Klaus whispered. Otto had no answer. December 30th, 1942, Camp Shanks, New York. The processing facility was efficient, almost mechanical in its organization. Each prisoner was photographed, fingerprinted, issued an American serial number. Klaus became PW31G174482. No longer a soldier, no longer quite a person, just a number in a ledger. But the food? Mein Gott, Hans stared at his tray. Is this real? Roast beef, mashed potatoes, green beans, white bread with butter and a slice of apple pie. Coffee, real coffee, not the ersatz chicory they'd choked down in Africa. Klaus picked up his fork, half convinced it was a trick, some elaborate American joke. Eat, commanded the American sergeant overseeing the mess hall. He was built like a bull, with a Brooklyn accent Klaus could barely understand. You're all skinny as rails. Uncle Sam doesn't want you dying on his watch. Bad for morale. They ate. Klaus couldn't remember when food had last tasted like food, when his stomach hadn't gnawed with hunger. Around him, men wept quietly into their mashed potatoes, overwhelmed by this simple abundance. This is a prison? Hans asked, incredulous. They feed prisoners like this? An older American guard, a Negro sergeant whose presence alone would have scandalized the race-obsessed officers Klaus had known, overheard and chuckled. "Son, you ain't seen nothing yet. Where you're headed, they got libraries, recreation rooms, sports leagues. Hell, some camps even got beer halls." "You're lying," the SS officer declared. "This is a trick." The sergeant's expression hardened. "Boy, I don't lie about nothing. You Nazis spent years calling us weak and stupid. Now you're going to find out what American weakness looks like." He gestured at the full trays. This is what we feed our prisoners. Imagine what we're sending to our soldiers." Klaus understood then, with crystalline clarity, the magnitude of Germany's miscalculation. The Reich had attacked nations that could bury them in steel and wheat and oil. America could wage war and grow fat doing it. January 3, 1943. Prisoner train westbound. The train carried them west through a landscape that seemed impossible. Endless fields covered in snow. Towns that looked prosperous, untouched, normal. Factories running full tilt, their smokestacks testament to industrial might. And everywhere, abundance. Klaus watched farmland roll past and thought of Germany's rationing, of meatless weeks and breadless days, of Greta's letters describing ever-tightening belts. Here, farms sprawled across horizons that seemed to have no end. America could feed an army and never notice. "Texas," Otto announced, reading a station sign as they stopped to take on water. "We're going to Texas." Texas. Klaus knew it only from American Western films he'd watched as a boy. Cowboys and Indians, shootouts and wide-open spaces. It seemed as distant as the moon. But the train rolled on, carrying them deeper into captivity, further from everything they'd known. At night, Klaus lay on his bunk and tried to imagine what came next. Would they spend the rest of the war behind barbed wire? Would they ever see Germany again? Would there even be a Germany to return to? Outside, America passed by in the darkness, vast, rich, and utterly foreign. The camp emerged from the Texas scrubland like a small city. Klaus pressed his face against the truck's metal slats, trying to comprehend what he was seeing. Rows of whitewashed barracks stretched toward the horizon, neat and orderly. Guard towers stood at regular intervals. Yes, but the barbed wire seemed almost decorative compared to the brutal fortifications he'd known in Egypt. Beyond the fence, he could see what looked like a baseball field. And was that a swimming pool under construction? "This can't be a prison camp," Hans Meyer breathed. "It's too clean." The trucks rumbled through the main gate beneath a sign. "Camp Swift POW Facility. Authorized personnel only." American guards watched with bored expressions as the new arrivals piled out, stiff from 3 days on the road. Colonel Samuel Harrington, camp commander, waited on a small platform. He was a man in his 50s with silver hair and the bearing of someone who'd seen action in the Great War. When he spoke, his German was accented but functional. "Gentlemen," he began, and Klaus nearly laughed at the absurdity of being called a gentleman. "Welcome to Camp Swift. You are prisoners of war, protected under the Geneva Convention. You will be treated humanely, fed adequately, and housed safely. In return, you will obey camp regulations, perform assigned labor, and cause no trouble." He paused, letting his words sink in. "This is not a holiday, but neither is it a punishment. You fought for your country, as did I for mine. That war is over for you. What happens next depends on your cooperation." The SS officer from the ship, Klaus had learned his name was Hauptsturmführer Dieter Kraus, stepped forward. "We are soldiers of the Greater German Reich. We will not collaborate with the enemy. We demand treatment befitting our status." Harrington's expression didn't change. "Son, Every prisoner here has the same status. POW. You'll get 3 meals a day, medical care, and the right to write home once a month. You'll also work, camp maintenance, agriculture, nothing that aids the war effort. Refuse, and you'll find yourself in solitary with bread and water. He smiled thinly. The Geneva Convention allows for discipline, too. Kraus opened his mouth to protest, but Otto's hand on his shoulder stopped him. We understand, Colonel. Harrington nodded. Good. Barracks assignments will be posted. Settle in. Tomorrow you start your new routine. January 11th, 1943. Barracks 7B. Klaus woke to sunlight streaming through clean windows and the smell of frying bacon. For a moment, disoriented, he thought he was home in Munich, that the war had been a fever dream. Then he saw the rows of bunks, heard Otto's snoring, remembered where he was. A prisoner, in Texas, America. Aufstehen! The barracks leader, an oberst named Wilhelm Fischer, who'd been captured at Kasserine Pass, made his rounds. Breakfast in 30 minutes. Don't be late. The Americans get cranky. The mess hall was chaos organized into lines. Klaus shuffled forward with his tray, expecting thin gruel or stale bread. Instead, the American cook, a cheerful black man named Sergeant Johnson, heaped his plate with scrambled eggs, bacon, fried potatoes, and toast. "Coffee or milk, kid?" Johnson asked. "Coffee," Klaus managed, still staring at the food. "Sugar's on the tables. Don't take too much. Ain't unlimited, even in America." Johnson winked. "But between you and me, we got more sugar than you boys seen in 5 years. Klaus found a seat beside Otto and Hans, who were eating with the mechanical intensity of men who still couldn't believe their luck. "This is better than we ate in the Wehrmacht," Hans said around a mouthful of eggs. "Before the war, even." "It's a trick," Hauptsturmführer Kraus announced from a nearby table, his voice carrying across the hall. "They fatten us like pigs before the slaughter. They want us docile, compliant. A true German soldier rejects this corruption." He pushed his tray away dramatically. Around him, a small group of hardcore SS and Nazi party members did the same, their faces set in righteous defiance. Otto leaned close to Klaus. "Watch Kraus," he whispered. "Men like him are dangerous. They'll enforce loyalty through fear, just like back home. And here, trapped in this camp, we can't escape them." Klaus understood. The war might be over for them, but another battle was beginning, between those who clung to Nazi ideology and those who simply wanted to survive. January 15th, 1943. Camp Library. The library surprised Klaus more than anything else. 2,000 books lined the shelves, German classics, American literature and translation, technical manuals, even some English-language textbooks for those who wanted to learn. American librarian Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, a stern-faced woman in her 60s, oversaw the collection with the zeal of a general defending a fortress. "Rules are simple," she told Klaus in careful German. "Books are signed out for 2 weeks. No damage, no food stains. Return them on time or lose privileges." She softened slightly. "I taught German literature at UT Austin before the war. These books are my personal collection. Treat them with respect." Klaus ran his fingers along the spines. Goethe, Schiller, Thomas Mann. Even some Heine, whose works had been banned in Germany for being degenerate Jewish literature. He pulled down Der Zauberberg, the Magic Mountain, and opened it reverently. "You like Mann?" Mrs. Patterson asked. Yes. My teacher in Munich made us read Buddenbrooks before." He trailed off. Before the teacher had been dismissed for political unreliability. Before the books had been burned. Before everything had changed. "Man lives in California now," Mrs. Patterson said quietly. "He speaks on the radio sometimes, condemning Hitler. Very brave, considering his family is still in Europe. Klaus felt something twist in his chest. Thomas Mann, Germany's greatest living writer, had become an exile, a voice crying out against the regime Klaus had fought for. What did that say about the cause he'd bled for in Africa? "Take the book," Mrs. Patterson said gently. "Read it. Think about it. That's all I ask." January 20th, 1943. Work detail. The agricultural work was hard, but not brutal. Klaus and 50 other prisoners spent their days in the camp's vegetable gardens, planting winter crops under the supervision of a local farmer named Earl Jackson. Jackson was a laconic Texan in his 40s who treated the Germans with neither hatred nor friendship, just professional courtesy. "Tomatoes go here, potatoes there," he'd say, demonstrating. "Any man who knows farming, speak up. Rest of you, watch and learn." Hans, who'd grown up on a small farm in Bavaria, took to the work naturally. Klaus, a city boy, struggled with the unfamiliar labor. His hands blistered, his back ached. But the work had a rhythm, a purpose that helped him forget, temporarily, that he was a prisoner. During lunch break, Jackson passed around canteens of water and packages of crackers. "Y'all work hard," he acknowledged. "Harder than some of my hired hands back home." "Why do you help the enemy?" asked Fritz Adler, a former Hitler Youth leader who'd lied about his age to join the Afrika Korps at 16. Jackson considered the question. "Son, I got a boy fighting in the Pacific right now. Marines. Last letter said he was at Guadalcanal." He paused, his weathered face unreadable. "I hate what your government did, starting this whole mess. But you boys, you're just following orders, same as my son. War's over for you. Might as well make yourselves useful." Klaus thought about that, about being useful versus being used. In Africa, he'd been a cog in a machine designed to conquer. Here, he grew vegetables, which was more honorable. February 2nd, 1943, movie night. The camp theater was packed for the weekly film showing. Klaus squeezed between Otto and Peter Vogel, staring at the white screen mounted at one end of the recreation hall. The Americans showed movies every Tuesday, sometimes westerns, sometimes comedies, always in English without subtitles. Most prisoners attended anyway, grateful for any distraction. Tonight's feature was Casablanca, still in first-run theaters across America. As the opening credits rolled, Klaus struggled to follow the dialogue. But the story was clear enough. Refugees fleeing Nazi occupation, resistance fighters, moral choices in an immoral time. And there, on screen, the Germans were the villains. Cold, brutal, the enemy of everything decent. "Scheisse," Otto muttered. "Is that how they see us?" On screen, Major Strasser, played with chilling efficiency by Conrad Veidt, interrogated Rick Blaine. The German officer was intelligent, cultured, and absolutely merciless. The audience of prisoners shifted uncomfortably. But as the film progressed, Klaus found himself drawn in despite himself. The romance between Rick and Ilsa, the moral struggle, the final sacrifice, it was powerful storytelling. And when Rick helped Victor Laszlo escape, when he shot Major Strasser, when he uttered that famous line, "Louis, I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship," Klaus felt something unexpected. He'd been rooting for the Americans. The lights came up. Men filed out silently, processing what they'd seen. Hauptsturmführer Kraus stood near the exit, his face twisted with rage. "American propaganda," he spat. "They poison our minds with their Jewish Hollywood lies. Conrad Veidt is a traitor who fled the fatherland. This film is an insult to everything we fought for." But Klaus noticed that even Kraus's most loyal followers looked uncertain. The film had been too well made, too emotionally resonant. It had shown them how the world saw them, not as heroes, but as the darkness others fought against. February 10th, 1943, late evening, Barracks 7. B. Klaus lay on his bunk, reading The Magic Mountain by flashlight. Around him, men played cards, wrote letters, talked in low voices. The barracks had developed its own rhythm, its own small society. "Letter for you, Brenner," Fisher called, tossing an envelope onto Klaus's bunk. Klaus's heart leaped. The censors had finally allowed one of his letters through, and Greta had responded. He tore it open with trembling hands. "Dear Klaus, your letter took 3 months to reach us. Mother cried when we learned you were alive. Father hasn't spoken much since you left, but he took your iron cross down from the mantel after we read your letter. I think he understands now that medals mean less than life. Munich is changing in ways that frighten me. We have air raids now. The British come at night. Last week, the Giesinger district burned. We spent hours in the shelter listening to bombs fall. Frau Reinhardt's son died at Stalingrad. She wears black every day now. The newsreels say we're winning, but I see the ration cards shrinking, see more women in black, hear whispers that people don't dare say aloud. Father's friend Herr Vogel was arrested last month. Someone reported him for complaining about the war. We don't know where he is now. Klaus, I'm glad you're safe, even if you're far away. Stay safe. Don't try to be heroic. We need you to come home when this is over. Your loving sister, Greta P.S. Mother wants to know if the Americans feed you well. She worries." Klaus folded the letter carefully, his eyes burning. Munich was suffering while he ate bacon and eggs. His family huddled in bomb shelters while he watched Hollywood films. The disconnect was overwhelming. "Bad news?" Otto asked, noticing his expression. "My sister says there are air raids now. Stalingrad is lost. People are disappearing." Klaus looked up. "We're safe here, Otto. Comfortable, fed, protected, and our families are dying. What do you want to do about it?" Otto's voice was gentle but firm. "Escape? Swim back across the Atlantic? We're out of the war, Klaus. That's not abandonment. That's survival. When this ends, Germany will need men who haven't been broken, who can rebuild." "If there's a Germany left to rebuild," Peter Vogel interjected from his bunk. "I flew reconnaissance before they shot me down. I saw what our armies are doing in Russia. Villages burned. People—" He stopped, his face pale. "We're not the heroes we thought we were." "Careful," Otto warned, glancing toward where Krauss's group sat. "That kind of talk can get you killed. Even here." Because that was the terrible truth Klaus was learning. The barbed wire kept them in, but it also kept America out. Inside the fence, the old rules still applied. The SS still enforced loyalty. Questioning the Führer or the war effort could result in a beating, or worse. Men who criticized the regime too openly sometimes had accidents, falling downstairs, choking on food, drowning in the shower. Camp Swift was paradise compared to a combat zone. But it was still a prison, and some guards wore Wehrmacht uniforms instead of American ones. February 14, 1943, medical inspection. The camp hospital was clean, well-equipped, and staffed by both American doctors and German medical orderlies. Klaus stood in line for his mandatory monthly health check, watching an American nurse named Lieutenant Sarah Morrison efficiently process prisoners. "Next," she called. Klaus approached the examination table nervously. He'd never been treated by a woman doctor before. It seemed improper, almost scandalous. Lieutenant Morrison was all business. "Deep breath. Hold it. Good. Any pain? Dizziness? Problem sleeping?" "I sleep fine," Klaus lied. The nightmares came most nights, memories of Africa, of friends dying, of shells screaming. She studied him with knowing eyes. Many prisoners have nightmares. It's normal after combat. If it gets worse, tell the orderly. We have medications that can help. Why do you care? The question escaped before Klaus could stop it. Lieutenant Morrison paused, considering. Because you're a human being under my care. The Hippocratic Oath doesn't have exceptions for nationality. She stamped his medical card. Next. Walking back to the barracks, Klaus thought about that. The Americans treated German prisoners according to rules, the Geneva Convention, the Hippocratic Oath, their own ideals of fairness. They didn't always live up to those ideals. Klaus had heard stories of harsh treatment in other camps, of prejudice and cruelty. But the ideals themselves existed. They tried. What ideals had guided the Reich? Macht, power, Lebensraum, living space, Rassenkampf, racial struggle. All the noble words about honor and duty had papered over a simpler truth. Germany had wanted to conquer and had dressed conquest in philosophical justifications. Klaus shook his head, trying to dislodge such dangerous thoughts. But they persisted, growing like weeds in the cracks of his certainty. March 5, 1943, Camp Swift, Texas. The beating happened on a Tuesday. Klaus was walking back from the library, the Magic Mountain tucked under his arm, when he heard the sounds. Grunts, flesh striking flesh, someone trying not to scream. He rounded the corner of Barracks 5 and saw them. Hauptsturmführer Kraus and 3 of his enforcers surrounding a prisoner against the wall. The victim was Ernst Zimmermann, a quiet Gefreiter from Hamburg who'd made the mistake of attending the camp's voluntary English classes. Learning the enemy's language? Kraus drove his fist into Ernst's stomach. Planning to betray the fatherland? To collaborate? Please, Ernst gasped, blood streaming from his nose. I just wanted to understand. You want to understand? Kraus grabbed Ernst by the hair, forcing his head back. Understand this. We are still soldiers of the Reich. The war continues, and traitors, even here, will be punished. Klaus stood frozen, the book slipping from his hands. He should intervene. He should call for the American guards. He should do something. But his feet wouldn't move. Fear, cold and familiar, rooted him in place. Fear of Kraus's fists. Fear of being labeled a traitor himself. Fear of the system that had controlled him since 1933, that persisted even here, 6,000 miles from Berlin. Otto appeared beside him, his weathered face grim. Don't, he whispered, gripping Klaus's arm. You can't save him. You'll just get yourself killed. We can't. Otto's voice was iron. Kraus has 30 men loyal to him. SS veterans, Hitler Youth fanatics, true believers. They run their own court inside these fences. Cross them and you'll have an accident. The Americans won't even know it was murder. Kraus delivered one final blow and stepped back, straightening his collar as if he'd simply been adjusting his uniform. Let this be a lesson, he announced to the small crowd that had gathered. We remain Germans. We remain loyal. The Führer expects nothing less. Ernst crumpled to the ground, curled into a ball. Kraus and his men walked away, their boots echoing on the wooden planks. When they were gone, Klaus and Otto rushed to Ernst's side. His face was a ruin of bruises and blood, one eye already swelling shut. Hospital, Klaus said. We need to get him to... No. Ernst grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. No hospital. No Americans. They'll ask questions. Kraus will finish what he started. But you need medical attention. I need to survive. Ernst spat blood. The doctors here are German orderlies. They report to Kraus. If I talk, if I name names... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They helped Ernst to his barracks, Klaus's mind reeling. Camp Swift wasn't a prison. It was a trap. The Americans controlled the outside, but inside the wire, the Reich still ruled through fear and violence. March 12, 1943. Colonel Harrington's office, Lieutenant David Goldman, adjusted his glasses nervously. At 26, he was young for intelligence work, but his fluency in German, learned from his grandmother who'd emigrated from Frankfurt in 1925, made him invaluable to the Army's Special Projects Division. "Permission to speak freely, sir?" he asked. Colonel Harrington looked up from his paperwork. "Granted. We have a Nazi enforcement network operating inside this camp. Hauptsturmführer Kraus has established what amounts to a shadow command structure. Prisoners are being intimidated, beaten, even killed for perceived disloyalty." Harrington's expression didn't change. "Prove it." "Sir, I have witness reports." "Prove it." Harrington stood, moving to the window that overlooked the compound. "Lieutenant, I've run this camp for 8 months. I'm aware of the tensions. But unless you can bring me concrete evidence and a prisoner willing to testify, my hands are tied. The Geneva Convention guarantees prisoners the right to maintain their own internal discipline. Even when that discipline involves beating men unconscious? Show me proof, Goldman. Photographs. Medical records. Something admissible." Harrington's voice softened. "I know what you're thinking, that I'm turning a blind eye. But we're walking a tightrope here. These men are prisoners, but they're also soldiers with rights. Push too hard and we violate international law. We become no better than them." Goldman wanted to argue that there was no moral equivalence between enforcing camp rules and enabling Nazi thugs, but he held his tongue. Harrington was old-school military. By the book, proper channels, everything documented. "I'm working on something," Goldman said finally. "A re-education program, approved by the War Department. Films, lectures, literature, showing prisoners the truth about the regime they fought for." De-Nazification. Harrington nodded. "I've read the proposals. You think you can change minds with a few movies?" "Sir, many of these men are just soldiers. They believed what they were told because everyone around them believed it too. Show them evidence. Concentration camps, atrocities, the lies they were fed. And some will question. Some will change. And the rest, the true believers." Goldman had no answer. Men like Kraus wouldn't be swayed by evidence or argument. Their identity was built on Nazi ideology. Challenge it, and you challenge their entire conception of self. "One step at a time, sir. First, we identify the moderates. Then, we protect them. Then, we give them a choice: cling to a dying ideology or accept the truth and move forward." Harrington considered this. "All right, Lieutenant, implement your program. But carefully. The moment Kraus and his people realize what we're doing, they'll escalate. And I don't want a full-scale riot on my hands." March 20th, 1943. Special screening, Camp Theater. Lieutenant Goldman stood before 200 carefully selected prisoners, men identified by informants and psychological profiles as possible moderates, men who might be reached. "Gentlemen," he began in fluent German, "tonight you'll see something unprecedented. Footage captured by Allied forces in North Africa and Europe. Authentic documentation of the war and its consequences. Some images will disturb you. All will challenge what you've been told." Hauptsturmführer Kraus wasn't present. Goldman had deliberately scheduled the screening during a work detail that kept the hardcore Nazis occupied. But he knew word would spread. This was a calculated risk. The lights dimmed. The projector whirred. What followed was devastating. First, footage of demolished German cities. Hamburg after the firebombing, thousands dead in the streets. Berlin's ruins. Munich burning. The propaganda had said the homeland was invincible, that the Luftwaffe protected the fatherland. The reality was apocalyptic. Klaus watched, numb. These weren't military targets. These were homes, schools, churches, his Munich, Greta's Munich. Then, testimonies from German civilians recorded by Allied intelligence. A woman describing her children starving. A man who'd lost both sons at Stalingrad, calling the war a criminal waste. A doctor overwhelmed by casualties, admitting the government lied about victory after victory while the army bled to death in Russia. "This is propaganda," someone muttered. But the voice lacked conviction. Next, captured German military documents. Orders from Generalfeldmarschal Wilhelm Keitel authorizing severe measures against partisan populations. The Kommissarbefehl, Hitler's directive to execute Soviet political officers on sight, in direct violation of the Geneva Convention. Casualty reports showing catastrophic losses on the Eastern Front, losses never reported to the German people. Klaus felt something break inside him. These were official documents, bearing Wehrmacht stamps and signatures. This wasn't Allied propaganda. This was Germany's own record of its crimes. Finally, the most damning evidence: footage from occupied territories, Polish villages burned, civilian executions, mass graves, and a brief, horrifying glimpse of something Goldman identified as a concentration camp near Dachau. Skeletal figures behind wire, bodies stacked like cordwood, the walking dead. The theater sat in shocked silence when the lights came up. "Questions?" Goldman asked quietly. Peter Vogel raised his hand, his face ashen. "That footage, from Dachau, is it real?" "Yes, taken by our intelligence services 3 weeks ago. But we were told the camps were labor facilities, resettlement centers for political prisoners and criminals." Goldman's expression was infinitely sad. "You were told many things, Lieutenant. Most of them were lies." Hans Meyer stood abruptly, stumbling toward the exit. Klaus followed, finding him outside vomiting into the dirt. "It can't be true," Hans gasped. "My father believed in the party. He said we were making Germany great again, protecting the folk. He can't have been supporting that." Klaus had no comfort to offer. He thought of his own father, who'd hung the Iron Cross on the mantle with such pride, who'd sent his son to fight for a regime that did this. "What do we do now?" Hans whispered. Klaus looked back at the theater where men were filing out in stunned silence. Some wept. Some looked angry. Some looked relieved, as if a burden had been lifted. "We survive," Klaus said finally. "And we try to become better than what we were." March 21st, 1943, Zo 300 hours, Barracks 7B. Klaus woke to rough hands dragging him from his bunk. "Raus! Outside! Now!" He stumbled into the darkness, surrounded by Kraus's enforcers. Around him, other men from the screening were being similarly routed: Otto, Peter, Hans, 24 others. Kraus waited outside, illuminated by a single lantern. His face was a mask of cold fury. "You attended the Americans' propaganda show," he stated. Not a question. It was, "We were ordered," Klaus began. "Silence!" Kraus's voice cracked like a whip. "You allowed the enemy to poison your minds with lies. You watched as they defamed the Führer, slandered the Wehrmacht, fabricated atrocities to justify their own crimes. But the documents," Peter Vogel protested, "they were authentic." Kraus moved with terrifying speed, striking Peter across the face. The Luftwaffe pilot went down hard. "There is no truth but the Führer's truth," Kraus hissed. "There is no honor but German honor, and there is no loyalty but absolute, unquestioning loyalty to the Reich." He surveyed the assembled men. You will sign a statement denouncing the American propaganda. You will refuse to attend future screenings. You will reaffirm your commitment to National Socialism. Or you will face the consequences. Otto stepped forward, his old soldier's bearing somehow still commanding despite the circumstances. And if we refuse? Kraus smiled, a terrible, empty expression. Then you'll learn what happens to traitors. Even here, justice finds a way. From behind Kraus, a figure emerged. Ernst Zimmermann, the man they'd beaten 2 weeks ago. But Ernst looked different now. Broken, his eyes dead. Ernst confessed his treachery, Kraus explained. He understood his errors, accepted his punishment. Now he serves as an example of proper rehabilitation. He turned to Ernst. Tell them. I betrayed the fatherland, Ernst recited, his voice mechanical. I sought to collaborate with the enemy. I deserve my punishment. Sieg Heil. Klaus felt sick. This wasn't rehabilitation. It was destruction. They'd broken Ernst's spirit so thoroughly that he'd become their puppet. You have 24 hours, Kraus announced. Sign the statement or join Zimmermann in learning proper loyalty. As they were released back to their barracks, Otto grabbed Klaus's arm. Listen to me carefully. Sign nothing. Say nothing. And tomorrow night, we need to talk. There are others, men who want to resist. But we have to be careful. One wrong word, one informer, and we're all dead. Klaus nodded, his mind racing. The camp had become a battlefield, but the enemy wore the same uniform. And the question now wasn't whether to fight, but how to survive long enough to win. March 23, 1943, midnight, behind the workshop. 20 men gathered in the shadows, carefully chosen for their discretion and their growing disillusionment with Nazi ideology. Klaus stood among them, his heart pounding. Otto spoke first, keeping his voice low. Kraus knows about the resistance. He has informers everywhere. 3 men have already disappeared, transferred to other camps officially. But we know better. What can we do? Asked Heinrich Brandt, a former Panzer commander. We're prisoners. We have no weapons, no authority. And Kraus has the numbers. We have something better than numbers. Lieutenant Goldman stepped from the darkness, causing several men to gasp. We have the truth. And the Americans' protection, if you're willing to risk trusting us. Klaus stared. An American officer at a secret meeting of German prisoners? The situation was surreal. I need witnesses, Goldman continued in German. Men willing to testify formally about Kraus's activities. With sworn statements, we can isolate him and his enforcers, remove them from the general population. But I need proof, and I need brave men willing to provide it. They'll kill us before we reach your office, Peter Vogel said flatly. Then we move first. Tomorrow. A coordinated action. You provide statements, we provide protection. Within 24 hours, Kraus and his top lieutenants will be in segregation, awaiting court-martial. Court-martial? Klaus asked. For what? The Geneva Convention allows murder. Goldman's voice was ice. We exhumed 3 bodies from the camp cemetery. Men officially listed as dying from illness or accident. The autopsies tell a different story. Kraus isn't just enforcing discipline, he's running an execution squad. Silence fell over the group. Otto finally spoke. If we do this, if we testify, there's no going back. We'll be marked as collaborators forever. If Germany wins this war— Germany's not winning, Goldman interrupted. Stalingrad fell 2 months ago. The Afrika Korps surrendered. The Battle of the Atlantic is turning against the U-boats, and soon, very soon, the Allies will open a second front in Europe. He paused. Your war is over. The only question now is what kind of men you'll be when peace comes. The kind who stood against evil, or the kind who stayed silent? Klaus thought of Ernst's dead eyes, of Greta's letters describing a city burning, of the footage from Dachau, the skeletal figures behind wire, of everything he'd believed being revealed as lies built on corpses. "I'll testify," he said. One by one, others joined him. Peter Vogel, Hans Meyer, Heinrich Brandt, 15 men in total, enough to end Krauss's reign of terror. Goldman nodded grimly. "Tomorrow at 0800, report to my office individually. Different times, different routes. By nightfall, this will be over." "Or we'll all be dead," Otto observed. "Or that," Goldman agreed. "But at least you'll die as men, not as monsters." March 24th, 1943, 0630 hours, Camp Swift. Klaus didn't sleep. He lay on his bunk, watching the darkness slowly fade to gray dawn, listening to Otto's steady breathing and the restless movements of men who knew something was coming. In 6 hours, he would walk into Lieutenant Goldman's office and sign a statement that would either save lives or end his own. The barracks door opened. Klaus tensed, expecting Krauss's enforcers, but it was only Friedrich Weber, the young private from Barracks 4 who distributed mail. "Letter for you, Brenner," Weber whispered, passing an envelope. Klaus recognized Greta's handwriting immediately. He tore it open, hands shaking. "Dear Klaus, I'm writing this from Aunt Margaret's house in the countryside. Munich is no longer safe. The bombing on March 9th destroyed our neighborhood. Our house is gone. Everything. Father's books, mother's piano, your room, gone. We escaped with only what we could carry. Father hasn't spoken since. He sits and stares at nothing. Mother tries to keep cheerful, but I hear her crying at night. The radio still plays marches and speaks of victory, but in the streets, people whisper. They say the war is lost. They say terrible things about what will happen when the Russians come. I'm frightened, Klaus. Not of bombs or soldiers, but of what we've become. Yesterday, I saw them take Frau Goldstein away. She's 70 years old, harmless, but someone reported her Jewish grandmother. Where do they take these people? Why does no one ask? I don't know if you'll receive this letter. I don't know if I'll ever see you again. But I need you to know. Whatever you did in this war, whatever uniform you wore, you're still my brother. Come home if you can. Or don't come home if it means dying for this madness. Be safe. Be good. Be better than what we were taught to be. Your loving sister, Greta March, the 10th, 1943. Klaus pressed the letter to his chest, tears streaming down his face. His home was ashes. His family was scattered. And somewhere in Germany, an old woman was being dragged away to her death because of her grandmother's religion. You all right? Otto sat up, his experienced eyes reading Klaus's expression. No, Klaus said simply, but I will be. After today. March 24th, 1943, 07:45 hours. Peter Vogel was the first to try. He left his barracks at 7:30, taking the long route toward the administration building as Goldman had instructed. But he'd made it only halfway across the compound when 3 of Krauss's men intercepted him. Going somewhere, Lieutenant? The speaker was Rolf Steiner, a former SS Unterscharführer with a reputation for brutality. Medical appointment, Peter lied, trying to step around them. Steiner grabbed his arm. The infirmary's the other direction. Unless you're meeting with the Americans? Having a nice chat with Lieutenant Goldman, perhaps? Peter's face betrayed him. Just a flicker of recognition at Goldman's name. But it was enough. Traitor, Steiner spat, and drove his fist into Peter's stomach. The beating was swift and savage. Peter went down, curling into a ball as boots struck his ribs, his head, his kidneys. Other prisoners watched from a distance, paralyzed by fear or indifference. Then Klaus was there, shoving Steiner back. "Enough!" Steiner turned, his fists still clenched. "You want some too, Brenner? I want you to back off. He's done nothing wrong. He's collaborating with the Americans. That's treason." "There's no treason in a prison camp," Klaus heard himself say, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "The war's over for us. We're just trying to survive. Survival without honor is worthless." Kraus's voice cut through the tension. He emerged from the crowd, his uniform immaculate despite the Texas heat. "Stand aside, Brenner. This doesn't concern you." "It concerns all of us." Otto appeared at Klaus's shoulder, then Hans, then Heinrich Brandt. One by one, the conspirators revealed themselves, forming a protective ring around Peter's fallen body. Kraus's eyes narrowed. "I see. So the rot runs deeper than I thought." He gestured, and suddenly 20 of his enforcers materialized from the barracks, forming their own line. Prisoners against prisoners, German against German, all within sight of the American guard towers. For a moment, violence hung in the air like static before a storm. Then, Colonel Harrington's voice boomed across the compound through a megaphone. "All prisoners stand down. Anyone moving will be shot." American guards poured from the towers, rifles raised. Lieutenant Goldman appeared with a squad of MPs, moving directly toward Kraus. "Hauptsturmführer Dieter Kraus," Goldman announced formally, "you are under arrest for murder, assault, and violation of the Geneva Convention's provisions regarding prisoner treatment. You will come with us. Resist, and we will use force." Kraus didn't move. His face was carved from stone, his eyes burning with fanatic intensity. "You have no authority over me. I am a soldier of the Greater German Reich, bound only by orders from my superiors in Berlin." "Your superiors aren't here." Harrington stepped forward, his voice cold. "I am. And in this camp my word is law. Surrender now, or I'll have my men open fire." For a heartbeat, Klaus thought Kraus would refuse, would force a massacre. Then, slowly, deliberately, Kraus raised his hands. "This changes nothing," he said quietly, his gaze sweeping across the prisoners who defied him. "The Führer's will cannot be stopped by prison walls or American guns. Justice will find you. Perhaps not today, but someday." As the MPs led Kraus and his lieutenants away, Klaus helped Peter to his feet. The Luftwaffe pilot's face was a mess of blood and bruises, but he was alive. "Thank you," Peter gasped. "We're not done yet," Klaus said. "Goldman still needs our statements." March 24th, 1943, 1400 hours, Administration Building. The testimony took hours. One by one, 15 prisoners told their stories to a military stenographer. Beatings, intimidation, 3 murders disguised as accidents, Ernst Zimmermann's rehabilitation that had broken his mind, the shadow court that enforced Nazi ideology through terror. When Klaus's turn came, he spoke clearly and deliberately, holding nothing back. He described watching Ernst's beating, his own cowardice in not intervening, the late-night threats, the atmosphere of fear that had turned Camp Swift into a miniature police state. "Why testify now?" Goldman asked. "What changed?" Klaus pulled out Greta's letter, smoothing the creases. "My sister wrote to me about an old woman being arrested because of her grandmother's religion, about my city burning, about people too afraid to ask questions." He looked up. "I spent 2 years fighting for something I didn't understand. I won't spend the rest of this war being silent while evil happens in front of me." Goldman nodded slowly. "That took courage, Obergefreiter. Real courage." "No," Klaus said. "Courage would have been stopping it earlier. This is just trying to be less of a coward." April 10th, 1943. Camp Swift. The camp changed after Kraus's removal. The hardcore Nazis, about 30 men, were transferred to a maximum security facility in Alva, Oklahoma, where they would be isolated from the general population. The rest of the prisoners, freed from fear, began to breathe again. Lieutenant Goldman's re-education program expanded. More films, more discussions, more exposure to the truth about the regime they'd served. Not all prisoners were convinced. Some clung to Nazi ideology out of habit or identity or genuine belief. But many, like Klaus, felt something shift inside them. The library became Klaus's refuge. He devoured Thomas Mann, Stefan Zweig, Erich Maria Remarque, authors banned in Germany, voices silenced by the regime. Through their words, he began to understand what had been stolen from his country, how culture and thought had been replaced by marching songs and racial theory. One evening, Mrs. Patterson found him reading Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, tears streaming down his face. "My grandfather fought in that war," Klaus told her. "He never spoke about it. I used to think he was ashamed of Germany's defeat. Now I understand. He was ashamed of the war itself, of what it made him do." "And you," Mrs. Patterson asked gently, "what will you be ashamed of?" Klaus thought about El Alamein, about following orders without questioning, about watching Ernst's beating and doing nothing. "Many things," he admitted. "But maybe shame is the beginning of wisdom." June 6, 1944, Camp Swift. The news came through the camp like electricity. Invasion. Normandy. The second front has opened. Klaus stood with hundreds of other prisoners around the radio in the recreation hall, listening to the BBC broadcast. General Dwight D. Eisenhower's forces had landed on French beaches. The liberation of Europe had begun. "It's over," Otto said quietly. "Even if it takes another year, maybe 2. It's over. Germany cannot fight on 3 fronts." Some prisoners wept. Others cheered. Quietly, carefully, but unmistakably. The hardliners muttered about secret weapons and final victory, but their voices had lost conviction. Hans Meyer turned to Klaus, his young face aged by everything he'd witnessed. "What happens to us when Germany surrenders?" "I don't know," Klaus admitted. "We go home, I suppose. Try to rebuild. Try to make something decent from the ashes. Will they forgive us? The people we fought against?" Klaus thought about Lieutenant Goldman, about Mrs. Patterson, about Sergeant Johnson and his cheerful distribution of bacon, about Colonel Harrington's stern but fair justice, about America itself, this strange, contradictory country that fed its enemies and showed them movies and treated them with a dignity the Reich had never shown its own citizens. "Some will," he said. "Some won't. But maybe forgiveness isn't what matters. Maybe what matters is whether we can forgive ourselves." May the 8th, 1945. Camp Swift, Germany surrendered. The announcement came at 1500 hours. Unconditional surrender, signed in Rams. Hitler was dead, the Reich destroyed, Europe in ruins. It was over. Klaus stood in the compound listening to the camp sirens wail, a sound of victory for the Americans, of defeat for the Germans, of relief for everyone who'd survived. Around him, men reacted in different ways. Some collapsed in tears. Some stood stoic and silent. Some looked almost grateful. "Gott sei Dank," Otto breathed. "Thank God it's over." But what came next? Klaus had learned that repatriation would take time, months, perhaps years. Germany was occupied, divided, its cities rubble. The Americans would sort through prisoners carefully, identifying war criminals, screening for Nazi Party members, determining who could safely return. And then there were the discoveries. As Allied forces liberated the camps, Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz, the full horror became clear. The footage Goldman had shown them years ago was just a glimpse. The reality was so much worse than anyone had imagined. "Did we know?" Peter Vogel asked one night, his voice haunted. "Did I know, when I flew reconnaissance over Poland, what was happening below? Did I see the smoke and tell myself it was just factories?" Klaus had no answer. Complicity came in many forms: active participation, willful ignorance, comfortable denial. They had all participated in the machine, even if they hadn't understood its full purpose. November 1945, Camp Swift. The newsreels from Nuremberg played in the camp theater. Klaus watched as his former leaders, Göring, Hess, Ribbentrop, Keitel, men whose names had once commanded instant obedience, sat in the dock, facing judgment for crimes against humanity. The prosecution presented evidence, documents, testimonies, films from the death camps. "Monsters," someone whispered. "They're monsters." But Klaus knew it was more complicated than that. Monsters were easy to condemn. But these were men, intelligent, educated, cultured men who had somehow convinced themselves that genocide was necessary, that slavery was policy, that destroying entire peoples was a legitimate political objective. How had it happened? How had a nation of poets and philosophers become a nation of murderers? The answer, Klaus realized, was that it had happened gradually, one law at a time, one compromise at a time. One moment of looking away when looking would have required courage. "We can't let this happen again," Lieutenant Goldman said, addressing a small group that evening. He'd become something like a friend to Klaus over the years, not quite, but close. "That's why we're documenting everything. Why we're holding trials. Not for revenge, but so the world remembers. So that when someone says, 'It wasn't that bad,' or 'It didn't happen,' we can show them the evidence." "Will anyone believe it?" Hans asked. "It's so horrible, so insane. Won't people think it's propaganda?" "Some will," Goldman admitted, "but we'll keep showing them anyway. Because the alternative, forgetting, pretending, moving on without accountability, that's how it happens again." March 1946, repatriation processing. Klaus's name appeared on the repatriation list. After 3 years, 4 months, and 18 days in American captivity, he was finally going home. Home to a Germany he'd never seen, divided, occupied, destroyed. Home to a family scattered by war. Home to a future utterly uncertain. "I'm scared," he admitted to Otto the night before departure. "What if Greta didn't survive? What if my parents are dead? What if there's nothing left?" Otto, who'd received word that his wife and son had survived but his daughter had died in the bombing of Hamburg, gripped Klaus's shoulder. "Then you rebuild. That's all any of us can do. We can't undo the past. We can only try to make the future less terrible." "How do we do that?" "By remembering. By refusing to lie about what happened. By teaching our children to ask questions, to think critically, to never follow blindly." Otto smiled sadly. "By being better than we were." The next morning, Klaus boarded the transport ship with 200 other prisoners bound for Bremerhaven. As the Texas coast receded, he thought about everything he'd learned in captivity. He'd learned that enemies could be decent people, that propaganda was poison, that following orders wasn't enough, that every person bore responsibility for their choices, no matter how difficult those choices were. That courage meant speaking truth to power, even when power wore your own uniform. And he'd learned that change was possible, that men who'd believed themselves superior could learn humility, that soldiers could become citizens again, that the future didn't have to repeat the past. The voyage across the Atlantic took 12 days. Klaus spent them reading Thomas Mann's essays on democracy, letters from Mrs. Patterson about establishing educational programs in occupied Germany, a copy of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that Lieutenant Goldman had given him. "Read this," Goldman had said. "Understand it. Then help us make sure it means something." April 1946, Bremerhaven, Germany. The smell hit him first. Germany smelled like ashes and defeat. Bremerhaven was a moonscape of rubble, every building damaged or destroyed, people moving like ghosts through ruins. The vaunted Reich had lasted 12 years and left behind this, a wasteland that would take generations to rebuild. Klaus processed through the British-administered repatriation center, receiving documents that identified him as a former POW, a Wehrmacht veteran, a person to be watched but not prosecuted. His record in Camp Swift had helped: testimony against Nazi enforcers, participation in re-education programs, clean behavior throughout. "You're one of the lucky ones," the British officer said, stamping his papers. "No war crimes, no SS membership, good conduct. You can go home." Home. Klaus took the train south toward Munich, watching devastated countryside roll past. Cities reduced to rubble, villages burned, bridges destroyed. Everywhere, the evidence of total war, total defeat, total collapse. Munich was unrecognizable. The train station was a skeleton of twisted steel. The old city center, the churches and museums and beer halls Klaus had known since childhood, was simply gone. In their place, ruins, rubble, and silent crowds picking through the debris. He found his way to his Aunt Margaret's house on the outskirts, miraculously intact. When Greta opened the door, they both stood frozen for a moment, hardly believing. Then she was in his arms, sobbing, and Klaus felt years of carefully maintained composure shatter. He wept for his lost youth, for his murdered city, for the friends who'd died in African sand, for old Frau Goldstein dragged away to her death, for everything that had been destroyed in the name of a madman's dreams. "You came back," Greta whispered. "You actually came back. I promised I would." That night, he met his parents. His father aged 20 years, his mother's hair gone white, both of them moving through the world like survivors of a shipwreck. They didn't ask much about his war. What was there to say? They'd all lost, in different ways. But over dinner, meager rations carefully prepared, his father finally spoke. "I'm sorry," he said, not meeting Klaus's eyes. "I'm sorry I raised you to believe in all of it, the flags, the rallies, the promises of glory. I was a fool, and I sent my son to fight for fools." Klaus reached across the table, taking his father's weathered hand. "We were all fools, but maybe we can be wiser now." Epilogue. October 1948. Munich, Klaus stood before a classroom of 30 students at the Friedrich Schiller Gymnasium, newly rebuilt with American Marshall Plan funds. At 28, he was young to be a teacher, but Germany needed teachers, needed men who could explain what had happened and why it must never happen again. "Today," he began, "we're going to discuss the Weimar Republic and how it fell, not because I want to assign blame, but because understanding how democracy dies is essential to keeping it alive." In his desk drawer, he kept 3 items: Greta's letter from March 1943, Lieutenant Goldman's copy of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and a photograph taken at Camp Swift in 1944. Klaus, Otto, Hans, Peter, and a dozen other prisoners standing together, smiling cautiously at the camera, men who'd found their humanity in captivity. Otto had returned to Hamburg, where he worked for the new government, helping to denazify the civil service. Hans had become a doctor, dedicating himself to healing. Peter flew for Lufthansa, the new civilian airline carrying passengers instead of bombs. Ernst Zimmermann had never recovered. Last Klaus heard, he was in a sanatorium, his mind permanently broken by what Krauss had done to him. and Kraus himself, executed at Nuremberg in 1947, convicted of war crimes based on testimony from the prisoners he'd terrorized. Justice, though it came late, had eventually come. After class, one student approached, a bright young woman named Ava, daughter of a factory worker. "Herr Brenner," she asked, "do you think it could happen again? Could Germany fall back into dictatorship?" Klaus thought carefully before answering. "Yes," he said honestly. "Democracy is fragile. It requires constant vigilance, constant participation, constant courage to defend. The moment we stop asking questions, stop holding leaders accountable, stop defending the rights of minorities, that's when it begins to die. Then how do we prevent it? By remembering, by teaching, by never being silent when we see injustice." He smiled. "And by understanding that patriotism means loving your country enough to make it better, not blindly supporting everything it does." Eva nodded slowly, processing this. That evening, Klaus walked through Munich's rebuilding streets. Cranes lifted steel beams. Workers cleared rubble. Slowly, painfully, the city was being reborn. Not as it was, that Munich was gone forever, but as something new. Something that might, with effort and luck and wisdom, be better. He stopped at a memorial recently erected for the city's war dead. Thousands of names, carved in stone. Soldiers, civilians, victims of bombing, victims of camps. His grandfather's name was there. The old man had died during a raid in 1944, never knowing his grandson had survived. Klaus traced the letters with his finger, thinking about everything he'd lost and everything he'd learned. The war had taken his innocence, his certainty, his faith in simple answers. But it had given him something, too. An understanding that evil was banal, that good required action, that silence in the face of injustice was complicity, that a man could be wrong and still become better. Somewhere in Texas, Camp Swift still stood, housing a new generation of prisoners or perhaps repurposed for other needs. But its lessons remained, carved into Klaus's soul as surely as these names were carved in stone. He'd been a soldier once, then a prisoner. Now he was simply a man, trying to build something decent from the ruins of everything he'd helped destroy. It wasn't redemption. Redemption was too grand a word, too easy an escape from responsibility. But it was something. A small act of resistance against the darkness. A quiet insistence that the future could be different from the past. And in a broken Germany slowly learning to breathe again, that was enough.